Well, hello. We're sitting here with beef jerky and junior mints and Coke, but no mirrors, Coke's in glasses. And we're just chatting about character development and character formations. And so I'll just start off with the first obvious question. What is the difference between intelligence and wisdom?
How many saves you blow?
This is always the question. I don't know how the game has gone on all of this time without this question being critically answered by somebody because after all, it is the question that will never ever truly be answered.
I'm gonna get it wrong, but I want to do it anyways, just because I lack good judgment. Difference between intelligence and wisdom. Looking at a stove and knowing that looks hot. Wisdom. Wiping your hand across the stove and going, wow, that was really hot.
And now I'll play devil's advocate. So does that mean that if you've done something that contributes to your wisdom that tells your intelligence later on that the stove is hot, that you should be able to increase your intelligence stat by using your wisdom stat?
Only if you promise to bare hand your palm into the stove till it is a bloody stump, and then based on that, argue to the DM that retrieving your arm from the ethereal plane is worthy of getting an additional intelligence point.
This could be really hard to build as a character creation scheme. I want to know what die I'm rolling to determine how hard I am wiping my hand against the hot stove in order to determine what my intelligence roll is. I think that if I just take 4d6 and take the highest three, that might be
My classic roll for anytime you want a stat raised. Chop something off, go to the ethereal plane, retrieve it, don't die by Stegosaurus, and then plead for additional point from God.
I did that in my world, didn't we?
Yeah.
Oh my god.
We did not get, I would like to note, we did not get an additional stat point. We did that, and we had somebody's age severely decreased. That
Yes.
was what we achieved.
That was when I was playing a rule that said that if you spent 3 years dedicating yourself to the increase of your constitution, that you could get another point of constitution, because I had gotten so tired of characters bitching and moaning about, I want another point of strength or I want another point of charisma, and I was trying to find a way that would be punishing enough to characters. Okay, you can increase your charisma, but your character has to age 6 years. And then somebody, of course, says, oh, I know, we'll go to the astral plane and we'll spend 6 years there, and then we can come back with my +1 whatever, and we can pick up the adventure as is. And for some reason, this is where my DM as cruise director thing comes in. I let players do it, and I've really gotten a lot harder in recent years because of this sort of thing.
It was fun, though. We killed 3 people, though. And everyone was like, oh, I should get him raised. And you're like, you're on the astral plane. Where are we going to get it raised? It's kind of dead now. Moving on.
Well, if you're going to do it the hard way, I need to make it hard. But I wouldn't do that anymore. I mean, that is definitely, and this is something I was doing, but that was 7 years ago, wasn't
Oh,
it?
that's forever. Yeah, a long
Yeah,
time ago.
this was something I was doing just 7 years ago. I know that many of the listeners have only been playing for 7 years, but for me, 7 years is like the blink of an eye.
We can go back and articulate characters and people we used to play with in like chronological order and go, remember that year? Yeah, we were playing with these 3 people that year. Yeah, it was a good year. Yeah, just because people come and go. So you get characters that come and go.
But they didn't go to other campaigns. They just quit the game.
They got married. They had children. They left for a country without webcams, etc.
Okay, but we didn't answer the question. What is the difference between wisdom and intelligence?
Wisdom would be me telling you to stop having this conversation. Intelligence would be acknowledging you're going to ask one more time during this podcast.
At least one more time. I wonder about the people who created the character creation system, because in a lot of ways, it's questions like that bring up the. I wonder if they understood it at the time when they invented the system in the first place. Did they have a conversation at a table where one person said to the other, "What is the difference? I mean, why do you have them both?" And the other person just felt that they should both be there, and they just sort of hand waved it, and thus 40 years of flame wars begin afterwards.
Like how all wars begin with a little light hand waving. I think you could describe things that way. Why did this happen? Well, someone waved their hand and we didn't get proper clarification, and look where we are now.
Well, character creation in general, I mean, there have always been weird things that have come out of it. For example, the comeliness experiment.
I don't know this one.
Oh, the comeliness experiment was when somebody decided that charisma should be separated from how you look. That you shouldn't be measured, your appearance shouldn't be measured by your charisma, that only your ability to
Also
speak
known as
and
the rewriting the English language movement.
it said very clearly in the DM's guide that charisma was a collection of personal magnetism and physical attractiveness and persuasiveness. Three convenient P's that Gygax created to describe what charisma was, which managed to clarify exactly nothing. Because after all, people really can't tell the difference between personal magnetism and persuasiveness either. So it's just as bad as intelligence versus wisdom.
Everything is going to operate on someone's personal perspective.
Right. And so it becomes difficult for a DM to make a call. You have to roll against your persuasiveness for this, or your physical attractiveness for this, or your wisdom for this, or whatever else. Diplomacy is the popular one. If I roll against my diplomacy and I succeed, then everybody in the world immediately bows down and gives me anything I want. If I walk up to a king and I say, "King, give me a piece of your kingdom," and I make my diplomacy roll, then of course the king immediately says, "Here, have this," and everybody else in the room next to the king, of course, agrees with the king because he is the king, and nobody else would say, Your Highness, what the hell are you fucking doing?
That's weird. It makes me think like somebody saying, nobody argues with Oprah.
Oprah. Diplomacy 5,000.
No one argues with Oprah. There is no question there. Oprah has spoken.
Character creation. Do you have any thoughts on it?
I think it depends on how you play. And I think when you start rolling a character, you have to think, how am I going to play? I tend to roll excessively charismatic characters. Most of the time people would think this is because I roll a lot of clerics or mouthpiece sort of characters. This is actually just because I tend to have the character that brutishly likes to do a lot of talking. So I tend to talk a lot to NPCs, which means being charismatic and not boobish is probably for the best. People I play with would never think I should get charisma because I'm a mouthpiece. Nobody would think that. They might think I would like charisma because I would like to not be stoned in the streets, but that's a much lower number than what I look at. I have played with characters that have a charisma of 6. Sometimes less, but usually due to something terrible. And they decide with their 6 charisma that they are going to be the advocate for the party. It is impossible to play that way. I suppose if you had a low enough score that you wanted to be scary and you actually caused fear, that would be different. But if you're going to approach a guard and speak to them with a 6 charisma, you feel like looking at somebody and saying, "Please don't pay any attention to my brother. He took a club to the head and he's never really been okay," and then someone else would have to step in.
This has been a long pariah of the system, is that our player characters truly limited by their stats, or should players be able to simply enjoy themselves within the game and role play as they want without having to be completely tied down to the stats that they're playing? I think it also comes down to a deeper question that comes ahead of that, is that are you forced to play a 6 stat or do you pick it? Because as you know, I run a system where you roll 6 numbers and then you decide what stat you want to put them under. And if you don't want to play a high charisma character or a low charisma character, then you can make your mind up not to pick that as a stat. But of course, people do pick a 6, so they do put the 6 under the stat because it's a dump stat, and then they want to play the 6 anyway. But do you think the characters should be able to choose the stats they want to put which scores under? Because a lot of people don't let players do that.
I think that's part of the reason why people lose players, is that I don't have any interest in playing a character that isn't of my creation within limitations. I want some control. And if my control is I have chosen to take a dump stat and put it on my wisdom and made my wisdom a 5, and then I start myself on fire while making a campfire, that's called action and then reaction and then effect. You know, you've made a choice and you chose to make wisdom your dump stat and then you chose to make a giant campfire. So action and effect.
Okay, but what do you think about the player who puts their intelligence low and then spends the rest of the campaign just milking their low intelligence because they just get such a rise out of it? That it's the player who, in the midst of the most critical moment of the adventure, suddenly decides that this is the moment that my character plays their 4 intelligence and gives away the whole party plan.
I know that we're supposed to immerse ourselves in the game, and you're supposed to live in the game, which sounds fantastic. But let's talk real world for 5 seconds. If you do that, and I'm in the big table in the outside world next to you, I'm going to punch you in the face. That is because in the real world, my intelligence is above a 4, and I'm going to punch you in the face. So there has to be some concept.
I'd just like to jump in and make the point that punching in the face is a metaphor, and that I did not raise my daughter to punch people in the face.
I have never punched someone in the face at a D&D game.
Arm, punch in the arm, but then all girls punch guys in the arm, so that's normal.
You're going to get a bad reaction from the table. You're going to have people not want to play with you, and again, that will break down your game. You have to think about how your character is playing. If there is an intelligence check and you are standing there, I do not appreciate DMs that go, well, I'm not going to make an intelligence check if Jimmy only has a 4 intelligence. No, I'm sorry. Jim is standing next to it, and it's really tough that Jim has a 4 intelligence. But we're going to just have to roll with it.
Well, I think there's a big difference between rolling a die because Jim has low intelligence or rolling a die that you would make for any other player in that circumstance against whatever their intelligence ought to be, and Jimmy fetishizing his suboptimality to the point where it becomes the Jimmy is an idiot show for every running.
I think it's an in-game thing. So you're an adventurer, and you decide that you are going to go into the world and get treasure, which is essentially what every D&D player is totally obsessed with treasure. And why would Jimmy feel the need to be dangerous? If he was that dangerous, would he ever be an adventurer? Would he ever have made it so far to be your character? And what in your world works in your mind to make you think, yes, of course, I thought I am totally obsessed with treasure and I am unable to function without harming others or myself. This is the best way to get to adventuring. You have to assume I became an adventurer as a character for a reason. You didn't pop out with a 4 intelligence and then just happen into it.
Well, a lot of people will say that Jimmy has somebody else in the party as a guide. But of course, I'm talking about that situation where the player is far more interested in how much fun they can have than they are in party or finding treasure or anything else that the party might be doing.
Teamwork skills are everything. And when I get these players in my world, I don't tolerate it. I know it sounds like I'm railroading, but it really hurts the game. You can do it a little bit, and sometimes it's situational and it works and it's fun, but you can't let it go on. People can't get masturbatory with it, that you have to take it away. And if that means that instead of saying, no, you have to roll up a new character, you have 2 conversations. You either say you have to stop doing this, you have to think on behalf of the other player's game experience, or you have to tell them, I'm sorry, maybe this isn't the game for you.
Well, when is it okay for a character to have some ability that is way below par? When is it fine? For example, we've talked in the past about what would it be like if you had a player character who, after you had determined that they were, because this is part of my own rules, after you had determined what their class was, that it turned out that they were blind. So what would you do with a blind fighter, or what would you do with a blind cleric or a blind mage? Would that be acceptable?
Well, of course. I like to think of it as rising above. Instead of choosing to make him an oaf that makes him part of the conflict, which I think is where these people go, they feel the need to be the conflict. And I think it's a need to be center of attention more than anything.
To be noticed.
Yeah, it's definitely to be noticed. You try to figure how you're going to make that creative. I definitely have said, boy, I'd love a blind character, which sounds terrible, but all I can think is all the neat, beneficial things that would come from being blind. You would be more aware of your surroundings. You would maybe feel things other people couldn't feel. You would have a perception of your environment. The fact that you would have to take the character in a different direction forces me to grow as a player. So after years of playing the obvious, sometimes it's nice to play the more challenging, but for my own personal growth. Not the need to make myself a problem where my entire party has to develop personal growth to fence me in. Because if I played with somebody who felt the need to be the problem, I tell you, you would be in a little wooden cage. And then when we felt we needed some sort of bait or something to pull a trap, guess who you would be?
Well, I don't know if I would be creating new rules for a blind person to be able to hear better or see better. I suppose I might be willing to give them some hear noise ability or some such. But I think the bigger issue is what you would do to compensate for the blindness. What weapon would your character choose? Where would you choose to stand in the party?
Well, that's it. It's prep information. Where would I need to stand? What would my surroundings need to be? Would I walk around a room? Would I develop some system with my fellow party members so that they could alert me that someone was on my left?
What spells would you pick?
Yeah, exactly.
Because you couldn't pick any spells that actually required that you direct at a target. You wouldn't be able to pick Magic Missile, for example, because you simply wouldn't be able to identify a target, and that's part of the spell. So you'd have to pick a spell that, I mean, something like Chant for a cleric or Prayer for a cleric would be an obvious sort of spell that you would want to take. Anything that allowed you to, touch would be an obvious thing. So as a cleric, anything that's a touch delivery spell, so that you could, and you would be able to recognize everybody else in the party by touch.
And I like the idea of a team inventing skill. It would be interesting to play with somebody who's blind in a large group of players, because of course there's noise during combat, where you had to develop some kind of system with your fellow players. That would be just interesting for everybody. It adds another dimension, which is what character building and expanding needs to be. If you go outside of Chains and Monsters, what we developed with characters was a need to create a different kind of play, not to make you Captain America.
All this assumes, however, that the character that you're creating, the blind character, or any other character that you're creating, is one that you want to keep, one that actually matters to you. Because obviously there are a lot of people who would have a blind character, find that they had a blind character, and they just run into the first battle, try to execute themselves as soon as possible so that they could roll up another character.
It's a lack of creativity. For me, I mean, I'm sure other people have other excuses, but I have played lots of different kinds of characters, and often with good stats, bad stats, medium stats, uninteresting things. You have to bring your own investment to the table.
Well, there are people who won't play with a bad character at all. I mean, any kind of a bad character, and they want to replace that character as soon as possible. That was a big problem I had when I was first as a DM, because I was uncertain about when you could draw the line on players who would self-execute, because they knew that they would be able to roll up another character that might possibly have another, better set of stats, and that they would basically just self-execute to the point until they got a character with good stats.
I like the rules we have now. If your character dies in battle or through a justified system, then you are welcome to roll a new character. If anyone questions whether you did that intentionally to just self-execute, you will not get a new character right away. If you are in a dungeon and you are nowhere where a new character would be realistic to be found, tough shit. We're going to do this whole dungeon and you're not going to have a character, and maybe you should put a little bit more stock investment than just a big murder hole.
I've certainly had characters, though, that I've had players that were just brilliant in how they self-executed. I mean, it was basically suicide by cop on a D&D level, that they were just waiting for the opportunity in the space of a night moving through a dungeon for when it was right to put their character in the way of in harm's way, so that they could, even as they were dying and rushing to get their dice to roll up another character, loudly talk about the fact that they had saved the whole party and they had done this amazing, marvelous thing that justified executing themselves.
I don't do it, and I don't know anybody else who does. We just lost a character last running that was a very mediocre character for that player, and he was still choked because he'd invested time, he had written the character sheet, he'd done everything he needed to do, and all he could think was, great, now I got to do this all over again. Once you start to get levels under somebody in any way, you feel purpose to them. But we have henchmen to grow on top of a character, so if middleman nobody doesn't quite do it for you, get him to level 5. You get him a henchman, and maybe you retire him to a lovely farm with lots of chickens. I mean, sending characters to the farm to play with the other animals isn't unheard of.
Well, something you just said there, It makes me think that perhaps pre-made character sheets are a bad idea. Because a pre-made character sheet, of course, means making the new character doesn't mean having to go through the process of putting the effort in to make a character. I just have to write a bunch of numbers and boom, I've got a new character.
It's the problem with a pet goldfish. When it dies, you really are just a $1.50 stop at the store. You're not investing, and you're not making that sheet particular to that character. And you haven't spent 3 days thinking about, gee, what would I like to have next? What could these stats give me?
It was not my experience when I first started playing this game. When I first started playing this game, this is 1979, and I was sat down at the table to play, I was told, in no uncertain terms, you're playing a fighter.
Me too, actually. The first thing I played was a fighter.
Yeah, you're playing a fighter because you don't know anything else about the game. So you're playing a fighter until you know something else. And then I was just basically told to roll these dice without it explained to me at all. Put this under this, put this under this, put this under this. Here's your equipment. Write down what I tell you to write down and do what I tell you to do. And good, now you're ready to go. And I was given no choices whatsoever with my first character.
The closest I got to choice was that was my first running. You are a fighter. Here it is. Plain and simple. Write this, write this, write this. But I was only, for you, you were that character. For me, it was just for that day. And they sort of had the attitude of, you're going to run with us. You're going to be a fighter. Get a feel for it. Decide if you like it. Watch other people play other classes. And tomorrow we will roll real stats. And then you can pick. And to this day, I would still rather start people off that way. Because it's, here's the game, get a feel for it, this is a fighter, and if you still like it or you don't like it, we will start again tomorrow and you'll get that fresh go.
Sometimes I feel that with new players in a campaign, they should all have to start that way. You're this. You don't get a choice. Until you prove yourself in this particular campaign, you don't get a choice. I don't play it that way, but I have had players come into my world where it was like...
It feels like a good vetting system.
Yeah,
you're a fighter, how do you feel?
Because
no mage elves here. Human, fighter, slug, monster, go.
I have certainly had players come into my world over the last, 30 years, right? 30 decades. I have had players come into my world that really were not mentally able to play the character that they imagined that they could play or had not really proved themselves. And it might have been better if that particular decision-making process had been taken out of their hands, at least for the beginning of their experience in the campaign.
I think people are unwilling to admit their limitations. I really struggle at playing a cleric. I always have. It is my worst class. And I have my first cleric this year. Yeah, my first full cleric this year for the first time in your campaign. I haven't played cleric since before I played in your world. And that's because my dad does them better, or that the system is really that different. But just because I am very unimaginative with clerics, and that makes me a weak cleric. Imagination is everything with magic.
Is it because of the duality that
It's the duality. It's that I'm not a fighter, but I'm not a mage, not in full effect. And because of the duality, I find trouble finding my place. You know, I'm not comfortable enough to run forward and be a meat shield, just as I'm not comfortable enough to stand back and be magical. And I find myself sort of standing in the middle of the room going, guys, did anybody over here? No, how, I'll just stand here. Well, I'm getting better, but it's a challenge.
That duality has disappeared from later games because the cleric has become the medic and there is no duality anymore. That the cleric was an interesting character once upon a time because there was an uncertainty about what your role in the party was. And I always presume that...
Now you're total party heal. You just stand here and heal. You're like a little beacon of stick.
Yeah, you are the lighthouse that stands in the middle of the party, and your role in this combat is predetermined, and that's a large reason why people just hate playing clerics.
Yeah, it's the duality for me. I'm much better now, but if I had tried to do this, say, 6 years ago, I think I would have found myself so frustrated that I would have retired him to the farm, playing with ponies right now.
Well, what characters do you really like playing?
I have an illusionist, and it's probably the biggest struggle I've ever had as a character for a couple of reasons. One, anybody who's played AD&D and seen the illusionist in the book, it's a very broken class with some major problems. We've fixed most of those problems and really enhanced it as a character.
but it is imagination 100%. If you are not clever, if you are not creative, you are everything a mage is without any of the power. You
Well,
need the power.
You've brought up the fact that most of your spells depend on an intelligence that you're fighting. That if you're fighting something that doesn't have intelligence, then for the most part, as an illusionist, you're pretty useless.
Dear God, I
And
hate
eyes.
underground.
It has
It
to have
needs
eyes.
eyes. Everything with an illusionist. You go to cast something and you go, it can't do that. Why? It has no eyes. It can't see what you're doing. And the need to have a quarterstaff is not because you need a weapon. It is because the need to beat something with a stick that has no eyes is overwhelming. Why don't you have eyes?
So,
Everything should have
If
eyes.
you don't have intelligence and you don't have eyes, then an illusionist is almost worthless. I like the class system in the original game. It's one of the reasons why I've continued to embrace the fundamental AD&D system. I've made a lot of changes, but I've never felt any need to make a change to the class. But I really hated it when, in the mid-80s, the other classes started to come into being, and now there's just this endless parade of almost irrational classes. It's not enough that there's a mage class. Now we need a sorcerer class and a witch class, as if somebody's sitting there with a thesaurus coming up with new classes because there's a different word for mage.
I only miss one class that does not occur in AD&D, and a lot of people will argue with me. But in second edition, I like the Cavalier, and I like the Cavalier because he gets a lot of advantages. He's a fighter class that's designed to work off of mounts. And it makes sense from original rules to have somebody who's well proficient in horses. You get it in the Ranger, and you do get that advantage. But I did like the Cavalier class in second edition. He's kind of a Paladin Ranger combo.
I would say that the most flawed character in the original game was the Paladin. For one reason only, because the whole basis of the Paladin was that we're going to give you a lot of power, but then we're going to take away your freedom of play. You can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. And if you do any of these things, then the DM will punish you. This puts you in the position where you're playing the toughest guy in the school, but you're the only person that the principal sends to the office. And everybody else gets to do pretty much anything they want, and there's no threat of them losing powers. But if you're the paladin and you say one wrong word or you kill the wrong person, then it all goes to hell. And when they brought in new character classes, when they brought in the barbarian and they brought in the cavalier, it was more of this paladin stuff. Is we're going to make you real powerful, but we're going to do it at the expense of you having to run your character in a very narrow tunnel way. And I really hated that. I just thought that was a very silly way to make.
I imagine that was what started the 3-point extravaganza on characters, was that it did take away the limitations. I will not accuse 3 of limiting character options.
Well, I just simply didn't like it. I've always been for player agency, and because I didn't play with alignment right from the beginning, and because I have no historical precedent for knights or paladins or any of that kind being particularly good characters. I mean, if you've ever read anything from the troubadour period, then you know that these people were executioners, and it just never made any sense to me. So I always felt that the balance for the paladin was the fact that they need a lot of experience to go up a level. And so as long as I didn't rush to put a holy avenger in a paladin's hands, here's your +5 sword at 3rd level, then I never really had any problem with how powerful they were.
It is such a slog, and I try so hard to caution people not to make them their very first character. Because I'm like, when you watch everybody hit 9th, and they're like, yeah, and I'm like, you'll be 4th.
Well, 7th or 8th, but it will hurt. There's no followers that you get when you hit 9th, so that's a definite punishment. There are all sorts of things that are there to punish the paladin, and really when you look at it on the surface, the various benefits that they get, well, they can be mitigated a little bit by the campaign without necessarily removing them entirely. And if you don't play as a DM, and if you don't present these little abilities that paladins have as superpowers, I mean, after all, detect evil is still only 60 feet. That's not very far, and it doesn't need to be very specific in the way that it's used. Then paladins aren't overpowered. It's just a lot of propaganda about that. I've never had a problem with a paladin in my world being so powerful that it made the rest of the players look silly.
You were talking about preconception with the paladins, and that they were basically executioners and things like that. This is my big issue with people who want to play OP characters, which is overpowered. I'm a paladin. Paladins are gods. paladins are superpower divining rods of horror. And then that's all they want to play. They want to be the strongest, most destructive. They don't want any limitations. And because they're creative, they'll try to circumvent the DM. They're power play.
The Munchkin character.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do they circumvent the DM?
Just little attempts, right? I'm going to argue that I detect evil at 60 feet, which means that I am basically running, or I am on a horse and I am moving 12 hexes around, and that means that I can sense all the evil as fast as I can, and I have drawn a roadmap while I come back, and now I know where all the evil is, and you're like, are you serious? Are we really having this talk?
Well, yeah, it's not a spidey sense. You know, it's not this eternally...
It also doesn't make you a cartographer. Detect roads or hills.
Well, I think that people have a tendency to be a little bit too liberal with certain class abilities, and they fail to recognize that everything has an exemption. Monks that can fall a certain distance without taking damage because of a certain level that they have attained, that's fine. But if the monk is unconscious, then no, the monk takes damage when the monk hits the ground. If the monk can't control their fall while they're actually falling because of whatever other circumstance that is going on, then no, that doesn't work. Everything has an
He
exception.
does not blindly leap off a cliff and just make it. Okay? If he sidesteps and falls off a cliff, I'm willing to make rolls that he goes slowly, but he's still going down the cliff. He didn't look before he left.
There's a rule, I think it's 13th level at a monk, that a monk can fall any distance as long as they're within a certain distance of a wall without taking any damage. And I'm willing to accept that. But if the monk is also trying to carry the illusionist while doing so, then no. I'm going to have to say either you take damage or you drop the illusionist.
I think I would make a rule to 200 feet, and you have to start making a very, very comfortable dex check just because you start to pick up speed. And I'm starting to think, I drop off a 500-foot cliff. I have a certain level of speed I should be factoring in here. I do have to hit the ground, and if I break my knees into my lungs at the bottom, that is not successful falling.
I think it's supposed to be something like the modern Chinese floating across roofs kind of movie-making thing that we've seen now.
All Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Yes.
Yeah, Stephen Chow falling from the distant sky.
Except if not properly moderated, it's Kung Pao, Enter the Fist, or something terrible. Like, it goes bad places.
Well, we're being really specific here, and we should get into a more general discussion of the topic. Now, it's something that you know that I do in my world, where I give you a background to your character. Everything that your character
we love
has,
the backgrounds.
everything that you do up until your character actually starts running the game. The premise being that you're 24 when you start running the game, and after you start running, you have player agency and you can do what you want. But your character has been on the planet for 24 years and something has happened. So if you have a very low intelligence or you have a very high wisdom or whatever, you have accumulated things that you have done in your life where you have made friends or lost a hand or you've gained a man-at-arms that is very loyal to you or so on and so forth. That these are all things that can accumulate over the 24 years you've been on the planet before you actually start playing.
I know these sound terrible, but I will never forget when we first did this system, we were playing with a cleric and she rolled, and not because her stats were low, but just because she could rolled so badly that she lost a hand.
She had a bad intelligence. She had a low intelligence.
But she rolled the minimum she could roll, like she was at the bottom.
Yeah.
And she was so excited to not have a hand. She thought that was the coolest thing ever. And I know it's like the worst thing to clap about being an amputee, but she thought that was great. She really felt that gave her character some leaping off point for personality.
But you think that the background is fine because
everyone loves the background. I've never had anybody complain.
Because people talk about the background being a straitjacket that I'm putting on characters.
See, we've always made it that it's something you can overcome. Remember, it's a world with magic. If you don't have a hand, it's not that you can't reestablish a hand, get a hand, work some system to get a hand, and that allows for a quest. She actually did quests to get a mechanical hand. It took us a long time, but she did get to the point that she was of enough of a level to get a mechanical hand.
Yeah.
And everything in the game is like that. If I am blind, there are ways to get cured of being blind if I really feel the need. Just like I can fly or turn myself into a troll or develop a mine where all I do is mine bones and dead dwarves. I mean, I can do anything. So I suppose in many games they think of it as railroading, but in our game where you just go, all right, my guy's endless quest is to get his hand replaced, there are many ways you can do it. Take up with gods, take up with magic.
What do you think about the alternative where you're expected to come up with a backstory for your character? I hate backstories,
I
but
hate backstories. I hate writing them. Mostly because I can be overtly imaginative and then I write a page and a half of uselessness. Wow, I've just killed a tree. Or you get someone like my fiance who is not a writer by any stretch of the imagination and he goes, this is Dirk. Dirk's hair is brown. Dirk is this tall. Dirk likes treasure. So it's an expectation on someone that really doesn't pay off for anything other than your own self-initiative. And you can do that with the pre-made backstory stuff. If I'm afraid of horses because I've rolled that, I can then go back at my own convenience and write this big long backstory of why I'm afraid of horses. You didn't say why I was. You just said I am.
I feel, though, as a DM, that if somebody writes something into their backstory or they create some kind of backstory, that I'm entitled as a DM to use that backstory in an adventure.
Absolutely.
If somebody tells me that their father was killed by somebody and that they didn't see it or they weren't there when their father was killed, and they're convinced that Mac the Knife killed their father and they've been on this endless search for Mac the Knife, then I feel it's perfectly legitimate as a DM for the player to finally find Mac the Knife dead, having been killed by somebody else who has solved the problem for the character, and the character should have to deal with that. Okay, you didn't get to kill Mac the Knife, now what is your character's purpose in life? And I think that that's a perfectly legitimate thing for me to do as a DM, because I don't feel that the character's backstory should be some sort of rule for me to live up to what the character feels that their future story should play out best. I should be able to muck with that.
I like it. We've done it many times. We've rolled up people who are lesser nobles. We've rolled up people that are... The best one was we rolled up somebody who was the daughter of a pirate. And his immediate goal was, all right, if I'm the daughter of a pirate, there is somebody out there who is a pirate, whose ship I am entitled to. And we immediately went on a quest to go look for Mr. Pirate and Mr. Ship and how we were going to walk out of this with a pirate ship. It seemed like a plan. And it gets you rolling.
Well, I've definitely gotten into trouble, though, with characters who didn't like me stepping on their fantasy.
I think it's an unwillingness to see past obvious game flaws.
In game flaws?
Game flaws in the fact that if you read any of the DM's guides for any game, even outside of D&D, you get these issues. It leaves a lot of room for a DM to make a game. And if a DM has basically handed you some plot, you don't get to sit there and say, well, I don't believe in that. So why should that be different with your character? If the DM says your character is 162 when you find them, and they've led a lot of life to be 162, why are you specially entitled to decide and say, nope, I don't agree? You're playing a game. The game has some rules. I'm sorry. This is Monopoly.
No, I agree with that. I agree with that completely. Well, I think there's only one thing left to do, and that's to answer the question of what is the difference between intelligence and wisdom. And I'm going to go with this because this is how I've always felt about it. Intelligence is the size, the shape, and the amount, the volume of the bowl. It's the physical aspect of the bowl itself. And wisdom is the amount of water that is in the bowl. A person can be highly intelligent. They can think through a given situation in the moment, at the time, and work out some sort of solution for that situation. But if they want information about something that's going on in the world, they're looking for an example, or they're looking for an explanation, or they're looking for a piece of data, or they're looking for anything like that, then that is wisdom. If you are walking along a path and you are thinking ahead of time, there is something that lives here that could be a threat. That's intelligence. But if you're talking about something where you're not thinking, but you're going to notice something that might have moved out of the corner of your eye and you're going to pay attention to it, that's wisdom. Your intelligence tells you there's something out there, but your wisdom is what kicks in when you're not thinking about it. If you're not thinking about something, then that is an aspect of wisdom when you notice it. But if you are thinking about it and you think it through, That's an aspect of intelligence. This has worked for me. I've never had any real problem drawing a very definite black and white line between these two aspects when I've looked at it that way. And I would recommend adopting it even if you don't believe in it, simply because it makes it possible in the game to have a clear definition for what affects what in what situation. And anyway, this has been our third podcast. We will get together. I'm not sure what we're going to talk about next.
We'll take some information from you. We're going to call it here, but I would just like to answer the few questions that were sent to us before. Mostly two of them I'd really like to address. One of them is very clear point about cost of books. In 1996, when I first got my hands on a second edition book and looked at prices, second edition was still printed, but not a prime book. The DM's guide for second edition was $20, which was somewhat manageable for somebody who was 8. Then by the time we were 10 and playing, it was still $20, but you could completely get that money. Third edition, the first book I ever touched was $60 and absolutely unattainable because it also required more than having just the DM's guide and the player's handbook. You really needed more than the 2 books, which was problematic and far too expensive. What's funny now is that second edition and AD&D in 1998 were both about the same price. Now, if you were to revert back to AD&D, you could pick up a second edition book for about $30. You could pick up an AD&D book for between $60 and $80 a book, which I find so funny because clearly that means I'm not the only one that reverted back to AD&D. And that brings me to the second question, why did I go back to AD&D? In second edition, anyone who's played, there are some fundamental game issues with the way the game builds on itself. Once you achieve particular levels, I couldn't give you the exact number because it's been so long, but for example, once you achieve level 6, your character is either so overpowered that you largely don't need the people around you, or you are so weak and it takes you so long to grow that it becomes exhausting. And I sort of look back at my dad playing AD&D and other people I know who played AD&D and thought this feels less damaged, it's much more fluid. At least the characters continue to grow, they continue to get stronger. I'm not going to hit a top out level. There's always going to be something to reach for. And that really brought me backwards. It helped that my dad played, but it did bring me backwards.
Did you have trouble making the shift backwards?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. 2 reasons. One, the treasure tables for AD&D are very different. And this sounds important for DMs, but it's very important for players because I had no concept of what was good treasure and what was bad treasure and what I wanted and what I didn't want. The other issue I had was now my character had a role and a purpose and I wasn't just flapping around in the darkness. I was this character. These were the things I was very good at. These were the things I was okay at. And these were the things I had no business being in. Second edition, this is what you're good at. This is what you can pretend to be good at. And you're really not punished by anything else but the DM's own imagination. So it was natural to put second edition down and pick up AD&D. And playing with my dad was much more pleasant. We're much more similar.
Would you encourage people who play 3 or 4 or 5 to go back and just give it all up and go back to AD&D?
You know, I would love to convert the world back to AD&D, but I truly believe that they would go, oh, of course I'll play AD&D, and they would quickly go, what the hell is this? They wouldn't know how to play. I think they wouldn't like it. I would love to encourage more people who play anything over 3 to go play Pathfinder, because Pathfinder is much closer to being the brainchild between AD&D and second edition.
Oh no,
And then if you play Pathfinder, come back to AD&D.
Oh, no,
You've already been trained.
I have a plan for this. It begins with first carefully seeding the Supreme Court so that all the people in the Supreme Court only believe in advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And then, once I have that majority, then I can pass a law that says it is illegal to play anything except AD&D, or in the very least, it's illegal to sell anything except AD&D books. And then at that point, even if other people want to play other games in their basement, they wouldn't be allowed to blog about them or talk about them. And all the new kids who came up, they would all come up through AD&D, and it would get rid of all of this.
Yeah, they would
stuff.
just question everything else.
That's
yeah.
right. They would consider everything else to be too dirty, or what their grandpa does, and then the world would be finally cleaned up, and the whole problem would be solved. This is my plan. It's a long range plan. The beginning of it is I myself get named to the Supreme Court, and then that I begin to build
Phase
to consolidate the
Phase
law
1, join Supreme Court.
That's
2, alter entire universe to whim.
That's right. That's exactly the plan. So we will come back and talk about another subject.
If you have any questions, guys, we will answer anything we can. And if we can't answer it, we'll make stuff up and answer it. So.
And for God's sake, give us a subject to talk about, because I know I will have something deep and meaningful by the time that we sit down to do another of these, but it would be good if anybody wants to weigh in. All right. So take care.